Hi everyone, welcome back. And today we're going to be talking about Chapter 17, the American Yawp. We're going to be reviewing the Conquering the West chapter. And so this is your classic story of the Old West, the Wild West. Now the chapter looks at expansion of settlers and railroads and industry across the American West and during the late 19th century. And we'll explore the transformation of landscape. We'll talk about the displacement of Native American populations and the growth of the reservation system and the ways in which the West becomes an important part of the national economy. So let's dig into this. The story of the westward expansion in the United States is often seen as one of rugged individualism. Now, these are pioneers heading west. They're seeking new opportunities, for example. In the late 19th century, the movement of settlers into the West had intensified. Of course, it's driven by the promise of land, resources, and economic freedom, especially after the Civil War. You've got many folks that just don't want to live in cities. The war has had an effect on them. And so this is another thing that pushes that westward movement. Now, in 1862, President Abraham Lincoln will sign the Homestead Act. It's a part of his campaign promises when he was elected in 1860. And the act offered 160 acres of public land to settlers, provided they lived and improved the land for 5 years. And this land was practically free, with a very small filing fee that was paid in order to put their name on the property bill. And this created a massive influx of farmers. If you're given 160 acres of land for free for 5 years worth of labor and living on it, well, why wouldn't you take the chance if this was something you wanted to do anyway? So farmers are going west. Ranchers are. Miners are. They're looking to stake their claims in the West. But by the end of the century, millions of acres have been settled, transforming the landscape of the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, and beyond. But I will tell you, many folks that go west don't stay. Living there for 5 years with very little infrastructure is difficult. And so don't think just because you got 160 acres of free land after 5 years, it was yours. Well, a lot of folks didn't make it the 5 years. They turned around and went back home to give somebody else the chance to settle on that land that they had so recently been unable to make a go of it. Now, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad also played a key factor in the settling of the West. The railroads connected distant parts of the country. It makes it easier for settlers to travel, for goods to move between east and west, for raw materials in the west to go to factories in the east, for finished products in the east to go to homesteads in the west, and so on and so forth. And towns and cities are going to spring up all along the railroad lines. And industries like mining, agriculture, and ranching are all going to boom as a result in the West. But expansion of settlers and railroads into the West is going to come at a tremendous cost, especially if you are Native American or a part of the Native American populations. Native tribes have long lived and thrived on these lands, but their way of life was disrupted by the arrival of settlers and then the U.S. government, who began to have a concerted effort to remove them from those ancestral lands. And hunting the buffalo gets in the way of railroads, and they trample farmers' fields. And so got a lot of issues here that need to be unpacked and gone through. Now, one of the most devastating impacts of the westward expansion is going to be the forced relocation of Native people onto reservations. And I don't have a map that I can show you here real well, but go into your textbook and you'll find one. The U.S. government negotiated treaties, often under coercion, that confined Native Americans to smaller and smaller areas of land. And just because part of the tribe agreed to this reservation doesn't mean that they all did. And some tribes resisted. It often led to violent conflict as well. So battles like the Sioux War of 1876 or the Nez Perce War of 1877 are just a couple of examples of Native American resistance to these policies. Now, perhaps the most famous confrontation of what we might refer to as the Indian Wars was the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, and it's known as Custer's Last Stand as well. George Armstrong Custer, a colonel who had been the youngest general in the North during the American Civil War, had won all kinds of accolades due to his service in that Civil War. After that war is over, the army is too large, and he gets busted down to a lieutenant colonel, and he goes west. And his job is going to be leading men out of frontier forts, particularly in the area of Montana and the Dakotas. Now, at the Battle of Little Bighorn, a coalition of Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, are going to defeat the U.S. Army 7th Cavalry under George Armstrong Custer. Now, this victory was a rare moment of triumph for Native Americans. Usually they weren't as successful as this, but it's going to be short-lived. The U.S. government is going to redouble their efforts to suppress Native American resistance, and within a few years, many of the tribes involved are going to be defeated and forced onto reservations. What made matters worse is that Little Bighorn happened in 1876, our nation's birthday, right in the middle of this swell of pride at America's 100th birthday, and it's going to redouble this effort to really end this Native American uprising on the plains. So that's going to be an issue as well. It's a matter of timing. Not all the members of the 7th Cavalry will be killed, just a small group under Custer. Others will show up later on when we talked about the Battle of Wounded Knee, or when you read about the Battle of Wounded Knee. Now, once Native American tribes are confined to reservations, the U.S. government begins to implement a series of policies aimed at assimilating Native Americans into mainstream American society. That word assimilation just means where you're giving up your old culture to sort of adopt the dominant culture at the time. And so that would mean more of the white or the Anglo culture that we know is dominant in eastern cities and in the settlers that are coming west. Now, one of the most significant of these laws that are passed, or these actions that are passed, is called the Dawes Act, and it's passed in 1887. Now, the Dawes Act sought to break up tribal land ownership by dividing reservation lands into individual plots, which was then allotted to Native American families, and the goal was to encourage Native Americans to adopt a European style of farming. You settle into a sedentary agrarian lifestyle, give up this nomadic lifestyle chasing the buffalo herds. Now, however, this policy is going to prove disastrous because much of the land that was left wasn't good for farming. Some of the best land was sold off to white settlers. Native Americans lost millions of acres of ancestral land, and again, hunting buffalo. And that's not what you're allowed to do anymore. You're supposed to put seeds in the ground and grow a crop in a land that, quite frankly, in many cases, isn't very good for that type of agriculture. Much of it's desert or very dry, less than 20 inches of rain per year. Now, in addition to land policies, Native American children are many times going to be sent to boarding schools where they're forced to abandon their culture, language, and traditions. One of the most famous of these is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And the motto of these schools often was kill the Indian and save the man. The assimilation policies devastates Native American culture and communities because it's taking their children away. But not only that, when the children do return to them, they really don't know where they are. They're not truly native anymore because they've been told that those cultures are bad. But they don't really fit into the Anglo society either because they look different and they think differently because there's still that element of native population within them. And so again, these people are stuck between one world and the next, and it's a bad situation all around. Now, while native populations were being displaced onto reservations, particularly, the American West becomes an economic powerhouse. Mining, cattle ranching, agriculture are all going to flourish in the different regions of the West. The discovery of gold, silver, and other minerals brought a wave of prospectors into the West, as we saw during earlier discussions about the California gold rush in 1849. And of course, there will be other strikes throughout this period in the West, like the Comstock Lode and different Leadville and different strikes throughout the West. Ranchers are going to capitalize on open range and to raise cattle and to drive those cattle to markets in the East. At the very beginning of this conversation, cattle are pretty much free for the taking in South Texas. It doesn't all it costs is what you pay a cowboy to round them up and get them up to the railroads that are starting to work their way through Kansas, particularly prior to the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Cowboys, often romanticized in American folklore, become iconic figures of the West during the period. And again, talking about these cattle in South Texas being driven up to the railroads. That's where cowboys are going to get their claim to fame. Herding cattle across long distances to railroad hubs from where the cattle could be shipped to markets, because we've got large cities that need food. Well, guess where these cows are going? They're going to Chicago, where they're being processed in meatpacking plants. Their hides are going to make leather and leather saddles and leather drive belts and all these sorts of things for the growing industrialization in these cities. At the same time, large-scale farming operations in places like the Great Plains are going to produce vast quantities of wheat, feeding the growing population of the U.S. and the world. Ships full of U.S. grain are going to be going all over the world. We are a major supplier of agricultural products out of the West. And by the way, at this particular period of time, getting to the 1870s, 1880s, the price of cotton has dropped. The South is still agricultural, but it's devastated by a whole list of circumstances. Now, what about the myth of the frontier? Even as the West is being transformed by industry and settlement, a powerful myth of the frontier begins to take hold in American culture, and much of this is coming from books, dime novels that are being published. You paid a dime. 10-cent novels. The idea of the frontier as a place of freedom, adventure, and opportunity all became central part of this American identity. Figures like Buffalo Bill Cody, which maybe you've heard about. Are you a Buffalo Bill fan? All right. He staged elaborate Wild West shows. In fact, even some of these Native American figures like Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse. I don't know about Crazy Horse. Sitting Bull for sure was a part of that. Annie Oakley, Calamity Jane, some of these iconic figures of the West, many of which are going to be famous because of Buffalo Bill. It helps to romanticize the image of the West that often is overlooked the harsh realities of life upon the frontier. Now, the myth of the frontier suggests that the West was a place of individuals that could achieve success through hard work, determination, but in reality, life in the West was marked by intense struggles, hot summers, bitterly cold winters, wildfires, insect plagues, disease. There's a lot of things here. But not only for settlers, but also Native Americans whose lands are being taken, whose lives are being dramatically altered as they're being relocated in many cases to reservations as the Indian Wars continue throughout the late 1800s. So, what else do you need to know about this chapter? I'm sure that there's more in there. You might even dig a little bit deeper into the frontier theory if you really want to get into the weeds. But for the most part, this wraps up Chapter 17 of the American Yawp. The settlement of the West is one of the most important and contested chapters in American history, certainly in History 1302. But shaping the nation's economy, society, and culture are all going to be a part of this settlement of the West, this Western story. So if you would like, and you want to subscribe to this, then please do so. If you want to like the video, that would be good too. And we will be moving now further through the Gilded Age. We'll start putting this whole story together and taking the northern cities and the southern Reconstruction and this western expansion, start putting them together to start telling more of a national story and move beyond the regional story of the late 1800s. All right, so hopefully this is helpful. Again, check back in if you would like to, and I'll see you later. Take care. Good luck with your tests.